At first, this looks like a normal family photo, but one of these people is dead, and you probably won't be able to tell which one. This photograph looks completely normal at first. A small child sits upright in a wooden chair, dressed carefully, his hands resting neatly in his lap. His eyes are open. His gaze is fixed directly at the camera. Beside him stands his mother, one hand resting gently on his shoulder, her posture calm, almost composed. There is nothing dramatic in the frame, no visible grief, no sign of urgency, just a quiet, still moment, captured as if it were any other family portrait. But the longer you look, the more something begins to feel wrong. The child does not move, his posture is too perfect, his expression does not shift, his eyes do not quite focus, and then it becomes clear. This is not a photograph of a living child, this is a photograph of someone who is already gone. And in the 19th century, this was not unusual, it was expected. Before photography, death erased people more completely than we can imagine today. There were no images to return to, no recordings, no visual traces of a face, a posture, a presence. When someone died, their existence began to fade almost immediately, surviving only in memory, and memory is fragile. Faces blur, details disappear, voices are forgotten. For most families, especially outside of wealth and privilege, there was no painted portrait waiting on a wall. There was no sketchbook record. There was nothing. And then, in the early decades of the 19th century, something changed. Photography appeared, not as a common tool, not as something casual, but as something rare, expensive, almost ceremonial. A photograph was not something you took often. It was something you prepared for, something you planned, something you invested in. And for many families, the moment they chose to take that photograph came too late. In a world where illness moved quickly and medicine lagged behind, death was not a distant possibility. It was close, it was frequent, it was familiar. Entire families could be affected within days. Children were especially vulnerable. Diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, and scarlet fever spread through towns and villages without warning, and once they arrived, they did not leave quietly. Many parents lived with the understanding that not all of their children would survive into adulthood. Some families lost multiple children in just a few years, and when a child died, there was often a realization that came too late. There was no photograph taken while they were alive, no image to hold on to, no way to preserve how they looked. And so, a decision was made. If the photograph had not been taken in life, it would be taken in death. What seems disturbing now was, at the time, deeply meaningful. These images were not created out of curiosity or fascination with death. They were created out of necessity, out of grief, out of the need to remember. Families prepared the body carefully. Clothing was chosen with intention, often the best garments available. Hair was arranged, the face was cleaned. Everything was done to present the person in a way that felt peaceful, familiar, recognizable. The goal was not to show death. The goal was to resist it, to create an image that still felt like life. But there was a problem. The camera did not lie. And even when people wanted to believe, the human eye could still sense when something was wrong. To solve this, photographers developed techniques. Bodies were positioned carefully, seated in chairs as if resting, supported by hidden stands placed behind the back or beneath the arms. In some cases, the dead were held upright just long enough for the photograph to be taken. Every detail was controlled. Lighting was softened. Shadows were minimized. Backgrounds were kept simple. Everything was designed to reduce the visible signs of death. And then there were the eyes. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. In many cases, the eyes of the deceased were opened manually, carefully, with precision, and if that was not possible, they were altered after the photograph was taken, painted directly onto the image, creating the illusion that the subject was still present, still aware, but something always remained off. The gaze was too fixed, too empty, too still, and even if you could not immediately explain why, you could feel it. What makes these photographs even more unsettling is not just how the dead were presented, but where they were placed. They were not isolated. They were surrounded by the living, parents standing beside them, siblings sitting close, sometimes touching, sometimes leaning in. Entire families gathered together, posed as if nothing had happened. There is no visible panic, no dramatic grief, no clear signal that something is wrong, only stillness, calmness, control. And because of that, the image becomes harder to read. There is another detail that reveals the truth. Early cameras required long exposure times. Everyone in the frame had to remain perfectly still. Even the smallest movement would blur the image. The living struggled with this. They shifted slightly. They blinked. They breathed. And those movements left traces, small distortions, soft blurs. But the dead did not move. They remained perfectly still, and because of that they often appear sharper than everyone else in the image, more defined, more fixed, and in some cases that is the only way to tell who is alive and who is not. If you look at these photographs long enough, something begins to shift. At first you try to understand what you're seeing: a family, a child, a quiet moment, captured like any other. But then your attention starts to move. It begins to search, and that's when the details start to appear. The position of the body feels too precise. The head is slightly tilted, but not naturally. The hands rest perfectly, almost too perfectly, as if they were placed rather than relaxed. Everything begins to feel arranged, not random, not spontaneous, controlled. And the longer you look, the harder it becomes to ignore. The stillness is different. It's not the stillness of someone posing for a photograph. It's something else, something more complete, more absolute. There is no movement, no tension, no shift in expression. It doesn't behave like a person who was alive, but it was meant to. These images were not just captured, they were constructed. Every part of the scene was carefully controlled before the photograph was taken. The chair was positioned, the body was placed, the posture was adjusted, even the direction of the gaze was decided in advance. Nothing was accidental. Photographers worked slowly, deliberately. They studied the frame before exposing the image. They corrected small imperfections, adjusted angles, fixed positions. Everything had to look convincing, because the goal was not to show reality, but to recreate something that no longer existed. There were tools involved in this process, devices designed to hold the body in place, metal stands hidden behind the subject, supports that kept the posture upright, stable, unmoving. Sometimes they blended into the background. Sometimes they were disguised as part of the clothing or furniture, and there were people involved too. Assistants stood just outside the frame, close enough to reach in but far enough to remain unseen. They adjusted shoulders, tilted heads, corrected the position of the hands, making sure nothing shifted at the wrong moment, because even the smallest movement could ruin the illusion, and if you look closely enough, you can begin to notice where that illusion starts to break. At a certain point, the photographs stop being easy to read. You're no longer just looking at an image, you're trying to figure it out. Your attention moves from one face to another. You compare expressions, you look at the eyes, the posture, the way each person is positioned inside the frame, and slowly a question begins to form. Which one is alive? Because nothing in the image tells you directly. There is no clear signal, no obvious difference. Everyone is dressed the same, everyone is posed the same, everyone is equally still, and that's where it becomes unsettling. In some photographs, the living are harder to identify than the one who isn't. The people who are alive shift slightly during the exposure. Their breathing, their blinking, their small movements leave traces, a faint blur around the face, a softness in the edges, something that doesn't fully hold its shape. But the one who doesn't move at all remains perfectly defined, perfectly still, and once you notice that, you can't unsee it. You start going back through the image again, slower this time, looking for that difference, searching for movement where there should be none, trying to find the one detail that reveals the truth, but sometimes it doesn't. Some images are constructed so carefully that the difference disappears completely. The stillness becomes shared, the illusion holds, and in those moments the photograph stops being a record and becomes something else, something that feels suspended between presence and absence, between life and something that only looks like it. And the longer you look, the more uncertain you become. The longer you look at these photographs, the less stable they become. At first it feels simple. You think you understand what you're seeing, a group of people, a moment in time, something captured and preserved. But then your attention begins to slow down. You stop looking at the image as a whole and start breaking it apart. Your eyes move from one face to another. You compare them. You search for differences, something that separates one person from the rest. At first, it seems obvious. One face looks sharper, another slightly blurred, One expression feels more present, another feels empty. You begin to build a pattern in your mind, a way to decode what you're looking at. But then that pattern starts to collapse. The more you look, the less consistent those details become. A face that seemed clear before now feels wrong, too fixed, too perfect, and a face that looked blurred now feels alive, natural, moving. Your perception begins to shift without you realizing it. You go back again, this time slower. You focus on the eyes, trying to find something human, something responsive, but the gaze doesn't change, it doesn't react, it doesn't meet you, it just remains there, fixed in place. You move to the hands, looking for tension, for movement, but everything is still, not relaxed, not active, just placed, and then you begin to notice something else. The image doesn't guide you, it doesn't tell you where to look, it doesn't reveal anything directly. Instead, it forces you to question everything equally. Every face becomes uncertain, every detail becomes unreliable, and that's where the discomfort begins to grow. Because now, you're no longer trying to solve the image, you're trying to trust what you see, and that trust starts to break. These photographs were designed to remove the obvious, to eliminate the signals that would normally tell you what is real and what is not. No exaggerated expressions, no dramatic differences. Everything is controlled, balanced, aligned, too aligned. There are images where the illusion holds completely, where nothing stands out at all, no blur, no movement, no difference in clarity. Every person appears equally still, equally present, and in those moments, the photograph stops behaving like a record. It becomes something else, something suspended, not fully alive, not fully gone, just existing in a state that doesn't resolve. And the longer you look, the more you feel it. A quiet uncertainty, not in the image, but in your own ability to understand it. What makes these photographs feel disturbing today is not the images themselves, it's the distance between how we see them now and how they were understood then. In the 19th century, death was not something hidden away. It was not removed from daily life. It happened inside the home, in the same rooms where people lived, ate, and slept. Families didn't step away from it. They stayed with it. Children saw it. Adults spoke about it. It wasn't softened or disguised. It was simply part of reality. And because of that, it didn't carry the same shock that it does now. The idea of sitting beside someone who had passed, of touching them, of being close to them, was not unusual. It was expected. It was part of saying goodbye, part of processing what had happened. Photography entered this world as something new, but it adapted to what already existed. It didn't change how people experienced loss. It became part of it. These images were not created to disturb. They were created to preserve, to hold on to something that would otherwise disappear. A face, a presence, a memory that could be returned to. And for many families, this was the only image they would ever have. But over time, something changed. Death began to move away from the home. It became something handled elsewhere, in hospitals, in places designed to separate it from everyday life. The experience became more distant, more controlled, less visible. And as that happened, the way people saw these images began to shift. What once felt natural started to feel unfamiliar. What once felt necessary started to feel uncomfortable. Because now we no longer experience death the same way. We don't see it as often. We don't stay with it. We don't interact with it in the same direct way. And because of that, when we look at these photographs, we're not just seeing the image, we're seeing something we're no longer used to understanding. When you look at these photographs now, you're not just looking at the past, you're looking at the difference between two ways of understanding the same thing. For the people who created these images, nothing here felt unusual, nothing felt out of place. They weren't trying to create something unsettling. They weren't trying to confuse anyone. They were doing something that to them felt completely natural. They were holding on to someone, trying to preserve a moment that was already gone, trying to make something stay, even when it couldn't. And in that context, these photographs made sense. They were quiet, still, careful. But now, that context is gone. And without it, the image changes. Because when we look at them today, we're not bringing the same understanding with us. We're not seeing what they saw. We're trying to interpret something through a perspective that no longer fits. And that's where the discomfort comes from. not from the image itself, but from the gap between meaning and interpretation. We expect photographs to show us something clear, something honest, something we can understand immediately. But these images don't do that. They don't explain themselves. They don't guide you. They just exist. And the more you look at them, the more you realize that you're the one trying to make sense of something that was never meant to be seen this way. Because to them, it was simple, but to us, it isn't. And maybe that's the reason it feels so unsettling. Not because something is wrong in the image, but because something has changed in us. Because we're no longer used to seeing things this way. We're no longer used to being this close to something we don't fully understand. So we search for answers. We look for clues. We try to identify what feels off. But what if the image isn't the problem? What if the discomfort isn't coming from what you're looking at, but from how you're looking at it? And if that's true, then the question isn't what these photographs show. The question is, why does it feel so difficult to look at them now? Look at one more photo. Who do you think is alive, and what made you decide that?